Hi, welcome to Move Leadership in Motion. We are back in the attic of the education wing of Hope Church, and we're recording up here because this is a great illustration of the importance of leadership. We have here this great resource of this space, but it doesn't function to do anything. It needs the things that leadership brings to it. It needs a vision for how this space could best be used, and in addition to that, the resources in order to accomplish that vision.
Absolutely, and that happens to be what we're talking about today, is leveraging resources. And keep in mind that when we talk about resources, often the first thing that comes to our mind is money. But the reality is there are so many other factors that go into resources. You have people resources. Do you have the right people for the ministry area? Do you have enough? There are time resources, because the people that we have, ourselves included, have time limits in their lives. There are place resources. Do we have a place to put this new ministry initiative? Do we have a building? Do we have land? What is it that we need? There are literal physical place issues we need to address. And of course, there's the money resource. Do we have the finances that we need to be able to accomplish what it is we have set before us?
So having had the experience of having to gather resources, if you're in ministry, that's a big part of what we do. We gather together the resources that we need.
It's
we have a
often
vision.
Herding kittens. Yeah. Come on.
We've got lots of ideas, lots of dreams, and so forth, but often feel like we don't have the resources necessary, and that can be a real killer for a ministry. That, you know, you're excited about what's going on, you're excited about the vision, but somebody in the process will come along and say, yeah, but we don't have the money, or yeah, we don't have the people. And that can really put a wet blanket on vision. So don't let no become the thing that stops you. Don't let the fact that you don't have all of the resources that you need in place as you get started stop you from pursuing what God is calling you to do. I remember back when the church was a couple of years old and it was growing and people were excited, there were a group of folks who came to me and they said, when are we going to start building the church? And my response to that question was always, we are building the church. The church is the people. And they understood that kind of, but what they really meant was, when are we going to start finding land and build a permanent building? So we put together a small team of folks to look for land, and eventually we found the site that we ultimately ended up with. It was in a great location. It was the size property that we were looking for, and we began to pray about that. The cost of it was way beyond what we could imagine purchasing. We literally had no money for the purchase of land. Around that time, a family came to me and said, we'd like to donate some money to the land fund to get it started. And they contributed $3,000. That $3,000 actually ended up being 1/100th of what the cost for the property was. But it was a seed that they planted, and when we began to tell folks, hey, we've been given a gift toward land, that got some other folks excited, and they began to contribute. And that resource became something that we leveraged to say, yes, we do have a building fund, and if you would like to contribute to it, you know, feel free to do that. And people began to do it, and then ultimately we had a capital campaign, and we purchased the land debt-free in 3 years. And it all goes back to acting on faith and not on fear.
Yeah, and I think that that is so crucial, because we often look at things within our own power. We think about it as what I can get or what I can do. And the reality is that until we invite others into this process and ask the Holy Spirit to start moving, we have limitless resources. We aren't even aware of what's out there. And so being able to put it out there, to cast a vision well, to not be irresponsible, but to be able to move forward despite not having everything lined up perfectly. Those things are what allow people to get excited, to get passionate, and all of a sudden you have people coming out of the woodwork, whether it's financial or whether it's people resources, whatever it is. All of a sudden you've got a whole team of people working to solve this problem rather than just you and your one or two people sitting in your office trying to figure out how you're going to make it work by yourselves. We really have to invite others into this process and ask the Holy Spirit to be moving in them and in the whole congregation.
It really is part of the whole deal. So for a long time, I looked at the gathering of resources as a necessary evil. You know, like, oh, we've got to have the money and we've got to find a place to meet and we've got to get people and if only we didn't have to do that, then we could do such great things. What I've come to understand is that process of gathering those resources and then what we're calling leveraging those resources, of putting them to best use, is part of vision accomplishment, and it's part of the spiritual journey. That in that process of gathering the resources and then finding ways to best use those resources is as much a part of the action.
Doing ministry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And when you look at those resources as just line items to check off, it becomes not only intimidating, but we sap the passion right out of it. And when we recognize that each line item represents an individual that God is going to be working through, or multiple individuals that God is going to be working through, suddenly it becomes exciting again. It becomes an opportunity to see people grow in their relationship with Jesus, in their faith commitment, and it can really kind of shift your whole perspective. Now, that said, there are often resources we have that we're not leveraging well. So there are times that we get caught up in making sure that we have this huge building fund, this big, safety net should anything go wrong. Meanwhile, we can't hire a children's minister and we're losing families because the programming isn't what it should be. So we have to be prepared to make sure that the resources we have, we're leveraging appropriately.
Boy. So this is one of my pet peeves. If you are pastoring a church or leading a church right now that is in a place that Heather just mentioned, you've got whatever the amount is, $50,000, $100,000, hundreds of thousands of dollars in a rainy day fund, and people are holding on to that with a death grip. It really is a death grip. It can choke the life out of the church. Now, you don't want to use those funds to cover your budget and fund things that are a regular part of your ministry. But what I talk about with leveraging that resource is to say, we want to hire a children's director, a children's pastor, because we have young families that we could attract to our church, but we have to do a great job at ministry to those kids. And we need somebody with that experience and those gifts, and we're going to have to pay that person. To take that fund and to say, we're going to use a portion of those funds to hire this person. And we're going to have a whole plan. We're going to set benchmarks about growth so we can track whether or not this is working and so forth. All of that needs to be in place. But funds are there as a leverage to help do the things that you feel God's calling you to do in order to grow the church. It's not to maintain programs, but to grow a program and ultimately to grow the ministry.
Yeah, and it makes me think of when we started the preschool here over 10 years ago. We were at a place in the church's life where we were truly just barely making budget. And here we were wanting to start this huge new initiative that had a lot of startup costs. We're talking about staff, we're talking about classroom equipment, a lot of startup costs. And we weren't sure where those resources were going to come from. But as we began to cast a vision and as we began to allow people to see God's hand, they jumped in and got on board. And before we knew it, not only were the startup costs covered, but the preschool was thriving and adding on a regular basis to the church's budget.
So one of the ways that we talk about finance here at Hope Church is it's part of ministry support. So too often in churches, trustees who are charged with overseeing the building and in some structures overseeing any reserve funds or finance groups. These folks look at their role in the church as protecting that asset, protecting the building, protecting the budget, protecting the finances. And so what we started many years ago here at Hope is referring to those parts of the ministry as ministry support. Their job, their function is to support the ministry of the church. And so if we have a ministry initiative and I come to my finance group, I'm not asking permission from them to do this. I'm saying,
get creative.
God's calling us to do it. Help us find the money.
Yeah, exactly. One of the resources that I think we often overlook are other churches within our community. So we often end up in this, I'm doing this, it's mine, I'm hiding it, it's my baby, nobody else can do this. But the reality is there are so many really great programs and people who are willing to lend a hand to share expertise. When I started the preschool, I would have been lost wandering around in circles on my own. But Morristown had recently done it, and their director came alongside me and walked me through the process and was an incredible resource that I was able to leverage. And I've done it for other preschools since then. We're currently doing it with another church who's looking to start a MOPS program because we've been doing MOPS for 11 years really successfully. And so I'm happy to be able to come alongside this other church and say, hey, here are some things that worked well, here are some things to avoid. So don't just think of your resources as what's inside your four walls. You have resources that are limitless if you're willing to make the ask and to reach out and look for it.
One other thing on this leveraging of resources, we are in the process, we've been talking about this in these recordings, about this campus idea that we're in the process of here at Hope. We're starting a new campus in a nearby town of Mount Laurel. And one of the questions we've looked at is, do we have the resources necessary to do it? And again, not just the money. Do we have the people? Do we have the equipment and so forth? And really the answer was no. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough volunteers. Yeah. We don't have enough. But we do have a vision. And we do believe that God is calling us to do this. And so back to square one, how do we gather the resources that we need? What's exciting in this process for us now is we're asking people to help us launch the campus, to become part of a launch team. And we're hoping to gather a group of 50, 60, 70 people who will go and begin to worship in this new campus in Mount Laurel. And that's going to create needs within Hope. And what we anticipate and what we're working toward is to say to other folks, you may not be going to Mount Laurel, but you're a part of this process. So we need you to help fill in these roles that folks are going to be leaving behind. And so again, it's finding those resources to do the things that God calls us to do.
And it can feel daunting when we're looking at it as these 50 or 60 holes that we have to fill. But the reality, again, is these are 50 or 60 individuals who are getting to take that next step in their faith with Jesus Christ. And they're getting to experience God in a new way. And suddenly it becomes less daunting and more exciting.
And the people who are watching that happen will feel compelled to step up in ways that they probably wouldn't have until this need was presented to them. This whole idea of leveraging of resources is a really significant part of what a leader does as part of his or her work within the context of ministry. So please don't look at the resource gap, the lack of resource, as a non-starter for you or as something discouraging. It's part of the deal. It's part of how you'll see God at work in your midst. If you are frustrated and no matter what you do, the resources don't come, that may be a time to step back and say, okay, let's re-look at the vision. Are we really sure that this vision is the right vision and that God's in it? And if not, how do we tweak it or change it? so that we can gather the resources ultimately that we need to do what God calls us to do. So we're going to be back in a bit talking about some whatabouts around this issue of gathering resources.
So what about when my church has a reserve fund, but they're not willing to use it for ministry? That's one of the first ones we'll be talking about. And our second what about is what about our church where every resource is already allocated? So we're looking forward to seeing you back shortly.